All right, well, thank you so much, Rosemary. And if you could pass slide control over to me. Thank you, thank you. Let me just go back to the title page. All right, we should be good to go. So good afternoon to everyone, or good morning if you're calling in from a different time zone. As Rosemary noted, my name is Andrew Schulte, and I'm happy to be your presenter today for this presentation of tracking greenhouse gas emissions in Portfolio Manager. If anybody has any issues with volume, or if I cut out at any point during this training, please go ahead and just chat a quick note to the host. And Rosemary, if there are any technical issues you see, please don't hesitate to jump in and make me aware. But for the moment, let's just jump right into the presentation content and talk about what we're going to cover today. So today's learning objectives, our intent is to provide an overview of the greenhouse gas or GHG calculation methodology in EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool, and also talk about some of the reporting functionality in Portfolio Manager that will represent emissions data. The goal here is to give you the necessary resources and track your building's GHG emissions using Portfolio Manager. And so we will, over the next 45, 50 minutes, walk through these three learning objectives together, and then we'll have some time at the end for question and answer. So just a quick bit of context setting as we get started. Why are we focused on buildings and plants when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions and especially emissions reductions? Put simply, commercial buildings and industrial plants together generate about 45% of all U.S. carbon dioxide emissions. So this makes commercial buildings a very important target for organizations that are interested in pursuing energy and greenhouse gas management and reduction programs. Since the inception of Energy Star, this program has helped to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by more than 4 billion metric tons, and a huge part of that is related to the more than 5 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity that have been saved through participation in the Energy Star program. All right, that was just meant as a little bit of background, but we're going to dive into our first objective now. So let's talk a little bit more about the emissions inventory approach that is taken within Portfolio Manager. All right, some of this may already be known to some of our attendees today, but for some folks, this may be important background. So we are going to do just a little bit of introduction here. As we discussed, the energy used in commercial buildings results in significant emissions of greenhouse gases. And when we talk about the principal greenhouse gases associated with the operation of commercial buildings, we're talking about carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Now, in Portfolio Manager, rather than calculating the emissions of these gases on their own, Portfolio Manager rolls this all up into a single carbon dioxide equivalent number. The methodology for calculating GHG emissions in Portfolio Manager is based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard, developed by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I did want to note that there are some limitations as to what sources of emissions are tracked within Portfolio Manager. Notably, Portfolio Manager does not account for any emissions resulting from on-site vehicle use, any industrial or manufacturing processes, or from fugitive refrigerant emissions resulting from a building's use of refrigeration or air conditioning equipment. These are important contributors to an organization's greenhouse gas footprint, but they are outside the scope of what gets tracked in Portfolio Manager. So there are two primary types of emissions that make up your greenhouse gas emissions metrics in Portfolio Manager. And these are direct emissions and indirect emissions. Let's start with direct emissions because I think they're a little bit simpler to explain. Direct emissions, which are also known as Scope 1 emissions in greenhouse gas accounting terminology, these are emissions that result from the on-site combustion of primary energy products, such as natural gas, fuel oil, propane, diesel, etc. Basically, if you purchase the raw fuel and that raw fuel is combusted on site in order to deliver services to your building, that would be considered a direct emission. To calculate the emissions associated with these fuel uses, Portfolio Manager uses what is called a default fuel analysis approach. And basically, all you need to know is the type and quantity of fuel that's consumed in the operation of your building. And from there, Portfolio Manager uses national average greenhouse gas emissions factors to determine the direct emissions associated with the types and quantity of direct fuels that you use on site. One point of clarification here, this methodology only accounts for the emissions that take place at your building. So any emissions associated with the extraction, processing, or delivery of these fuels is not attributed to you or your building in Portfolio Manager. Those are attributed to the fuel supplier. It does not fall within your inventory. Now, Energy Star has a lot of documentation on greenhouse gas calculations in the Portfolio Manager tool. But as I noted, for direct greenhouse gas emissions factors, or for direct fuels, there is a single national factor that is applied for each fuel type. And that is summarized here on this screen in this chart. But this chart actually comes out of a technical reference document that is linked to later on in this presentation. But the point here is no matter where you are in the country, if you consume a MBTU's worth of natural gas, that is associated with 53.11 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions resulting from that consumption, and so on and so forth down through the different fuel types. All right, now we're going to talk about indirect emissions, which are frequently fall into Scope 2 in the greenhouse gas accounting world. These are emissions that result from the purchase of energy that is delivered by a utility. So great examples here would be electricity, district steam, district hot water, district chilled water. Essentially, in these cases, what you are purchasing is not the raw fuel. You're not combusting the raw fuel on site. Rather, somebody else, a utility or a district energy provider, is doing the actual consumption of the raw fuel, and what they're delivering to you is a secondary fuel source. Therefore, these emissions factors have to account for the emissions associated with the power generation. I will note that any emissions associated with energy losses from transmission and distribution are attributed to the utility and not to your building. But again, because secondary energy types such as electricity are different in terms of where they are, where the combustion happens, compared to the direct or Scope 1 fuels, and that's why they have their own bin. So as we mentioned, the main sources of indirect emissions are electricity and district fuels. One thing that is different from the direct fuels, however, is that is the way in which emissions factors are applied. So for district sources, there are nationwide emissions factors that are applied. For electricity, however, the emissions factor that gets applied is based on what region your building falls in. So let's talk a little bit more about that. As I noted, if you are consuming, reflecting the consumption of a district fuel source in Portfolio Manager, you are going to get a specified emissions factor as noted in this table on this screen, and that's going to take place. That's going to be applied regardless of where your building is located. However, if you use in accounting for electricity, the emissions factor associated with your electricity consumption will depend on the region, or in this case, actually specifically the sub-region in which your building is located. And these subregions are defined by the US EPA's Emissions and Generation Resource Integrated Database, or eGrid. And basically, when you enter a building into Portfolio Manager and you enter your zip code, Portfolio Manager maps your building to a designated subregion, and each subregion has its own emissions factor. And that is what is used for your particular building and calculating the emissions associated with electricity consumption at your building. So I do want to point out, for those of you that maybe have gone a little bit deeper into greenhouse gas emissions inventorying and tracking, I did want to note that there are two approaches for calculating indirect emissions. One of these is called the location-based method, and it uses grid average emissions factors. So the approach that we just discussed, the use of the eGrid subregions, that is consistent with the location-based approach. There is another method for calculating greenhouse gas emissions called the market-based method, and that approach uses energy supplier specific emissions factors, which in some cases may be different than the sub-regional emissions factor that comes from eGrid. And since 2015, WRI and its greenhouse gas protocol have recommended that anybody performing a greenhouse gas inventory calculate both their location-based and market-based indirect emissions. However, in Portfolio Manager presently, only the location-based approach is used. So while it is definitely relevant, this idea of the market-based approach to indirect emissions, currently Portfolio Manager is most aligned with the location-based approach. We are in the process of finalizing, and EPA will be launching a new calculator tool that lives outside of Portfolio Manager that will allow for the application of market-based emissions factors. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. All right, but in summary, at the highest level, when you benchmark your building in Portfolio Manager and you look for the metric total greenhouse gas emissions, that is comprised of the direct emissions associated with on-site combusted fuels, and then added to your indirect emissions, or the emissions associated with fuel sources that were delivered to you, even though the generation happened off-site. All right, so that is, we've gone through the first step, which is to talk generally about how Portfolio Manager addresses greenhouse gas emissions. Again, it's looking at direct emissions and indirect emissions. And for indirect emissions, it's using a location-based approach for electricity, where the emissions rate applied to your building's electricity consumption will be based on the subregion in which your building is located. Now, direct and indirect emissions are going to make up the backbone of your greenhouse gas inventory in Portfolio Manager, but we want to talk a little bit about green power, because green power also has a significant impact on the metrics that Portfolio Manager can provide. So the purchase and use of green power can help to reduce the environmental impact associated with the generation of electricity for use in your building. Green power, in the context of what you're tracking in Portfolio Manager, it can be obtained from either on-site sources like on-site solar photovoltaic or wind turbines, or it can be obtained from off-site sources. So a solar or a wind farm that is located separately from your building. The methodology used by Portfolio Manager to account for the impact of green power on your emissions inventory depends on whether the green power is generated on-site or off-site, and also whether the renewable energy certificates or RECs associated with that green power have been retained. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of RECs, but just in case you're not, a REC, or renewable energy certificate, quantifies the location, generation method, and environmental benefit of on-site renewable electricity generation or off-site produced green power purchases. It's the REC that defines your power as green, and that allows you to convey ownership of these environmental claims. So if you own the RECs, you can say that you have green power. If you've sold the RECs, you can no longer say that your power is green. The emissions avoided from the use of green power can also be tracked in Portfolio Manager. But it's important to note that avoided emissions is a separate metric in Portfolio Manager, and it is calculated separately from your total greenhouse gas emissions. All right, that was a lot of overview, but let's talk through how this actually applies within Portfolio Manager. And let's start with the emissions benefits from on-site green power. So as many of you are probably aware, Portfolio Manager does contain functionality that allows you to track energy consumption that was generated on-site at your property via solar, PV, or wind turbines. So how it affects your greenhouse gas metrics in Portfolio Manager really depends on whether you use the power on-site or you export it back to the grid, and whether you retain the renewable energy certificates or RECs, or whether you sell them. So if the RECs are retained and you are consuming energy on-site that you generated on-site, then you own the environmental claims to that green power. And the power from the on-site renewables that are consumed to operate your building will be counted as zero emissions in your total greenhouse gas emissions. Portfolio Manager will separately also track the avoided emissions that are associated with your on-site green power generation. But as I mentioned before, that is a separate metric. Avoided emissions are separate from total emissions. But again, the note here is if you generate the power on-site and you retain the RECs, then Portfolio Manager applies an emissions factor of 0 to that portion of the energy you consumed. Now, what happens if you have a solar PV system on your building, but you export some or even all of the electricity that you generate on site? Well, in that case, presuming that, sorry, I misspoke there. Let me back up. We're not talking about selling back energy. We're talking about selling the RECs. Some building owners may choose, as part of a financing mechanism around on-site renewables, to sell the renewable energy certificates that are associated with their green power production. So they may keep the power that's generated, but they may sell the RECs. And it's important to note here that if you sell your RECs, you no longer own the environmental claims to the energy, Therefore, it's no longer considered green power. Okay, and so the energy that you generate on site and use on site from an emissions perspective is going to be treated as if it were grid electricity. Okay, so just again, whether portfolio manager counts your on-site renewable energy as a zero emissions resource is going to depend on whether you retain the RECs. And this is one thing I had actually jumped ahead to this earlier when I was talking about, whether you consume the energy on site or whether you, sell it back to the grid. The emissions benefits associated with on-site green power generation are based on the total amount of energy that you consume from your on-site system. So it's very common in interconnection scenarios that, if during a given period of time, you generate more electricity on site than is needed, the excess will be sent back to the grid. From a greenhouse gas emissions calculation perspective in Portfolio Manager, you're not getting credit for renewable energy that you sold back to the grid. You're only getting credit for the energy that you generated on site and used on site. And that's why, if you're familiar with how to enter on-site green power in Portfolio Manager, you are required to indicate both the amount of energy that was generated on-site and used on-site, and the amount of energy that was generated on-site and exported off-site. All right, now let's talk about how Portfolio Manager treats off-site green power. So what do we mean when we talk about off-site green power? Well, one typical example here is a product that you purchase from either your local utility or a third-party supplier. Typically, the supplier will, in selling you a green power product, the supplier will typically bundle RECs alongside with a quantity of physical electricity, of kilowatt hours, and they sell that to you in a single product. Now, the actual kilowatt hours may not have been generated renewably, but what you are buying is a quantity of electricity along with a corresponding number of RECs. And because, as we discussed earlier, it's the renewable energy certificate that determines whether power is green or not. If you are buying a bundled green power product that consists of both kilowatt hours and RECs, that energy can be considered green for the purposes of greenhouse gas accounting. Now, in Portfolio Manager, it's important to note that off-site green power purchases can be tracked, and you can specifically identify, for instance, if you're purchasing a green power product from your utility where you're paying a premium to know that 40% of the energy you consume is coming from, renewably sourced power, you would be able to indicate in Portfolio Manager every time you go in to enter your electricity consumption that 40% of each consumption value is represented by off-site green power. So there is a way to track that in Portfolio Manager. However, in terms of the metrics that Portfolio Manager calculates, the place where you see your benefit associated with on-site green power will be in the avoided emissions. Okay, so again, I mentioned before that in Portfolio Manager, the metrics total emissions and avoided emissions are two separate categories. Off-site green power will be reflected in avoided emissions. It will not have any impact on your total greenhouse gas emissions. Why is that important? Well, even though they're not part of your total greenhouse gas emissions, off-site green power still is associated with marginal load reductions where the power is produced, where those RECs were initially created. So the avoided emissions metric does give you some insight into the emissions benefits of your green power purchases, and that's why that value is tracked in Portfolio Manager. And for more information about how the different categories of emissions are calculated, whether total greenhouse gas emissions or avoided greenhouse gas emissions, that is documented at some length in some EPA technical resource documents that we will link to at the end of this presentation. And just to answer one question that I did see come through, yes, we will be sending you a copy of this presentation. All attendees will receive a PDF copy of these slides, which will contain live hyperlinks to any resources that were discussed during this training. All right, so one final item here has to do with the impact of green power on your greenhouse gas emissions versus your Energy Star score. So in particular, it's possible that two properties could have the same Energy Star score, but different greenhouse gas emissions, or vice versa. You could have the same greenhouse gas emissions, but a different Energy Star score. Well, why is that? So it's important to remember that the Energy Star score, the 1 to 100 score that your building receives, is a measure of the energy performance of a property, right? It's efficiency. It is not specifically related to a building's greenhouse gas emissions. You could have a building that is located, two buildings that are getting the Energy Star score, but they are located in different parts of the country, and therefore the emissions rate for electricity for one building is lower than the emissions rate for the other building, right? And in that situation, you could have two buildings that get the exact same Energy Star score, but the emissions associated with that level of building performance are going to be different because of different regional emissions factors. So what are the two ways in which greenhouse gas emissions can be, emission reductions can be achieved and can be reflected and captured in Portfolio Manager? The most straightforward way, it's always going to be increasing your building's energy efficiency, right? The more efficient your building is, the less energy you use, therefore the fewer emissions associated with that energy use. You can also improve your greenhouse gas emissions. You can reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by offsetting, by replacing some portion of your grid electricity consumption with on-site renewable energy consumption, and then also by increasing increasing the proportion of that on-site green power that makes up your building's fuel mix. All right, let's move on to our final section now. And this is where we're going to talk a little bit about Portfolio Manager's greenhouse gas emissions reporting functionalities. So we've talked about how greenhouse gas emissions are calculated in Portfolio Manager, how those calculations can be impacted by the use of on-site or off-site green power. Now we're going to talk about where you would go to actually see that information in Portfolio Manager. So what I've got here are screenshots, and if anybody is having difficulty seeing, I can also go to a live screen share. So please let us know. But I'll start down this path, and then if anybody wants to see, me dig in a little bit further, I can go to my web browser. So many of you, especially if you've taken the Portfolio Manager 101, 201, 301 series, you're probably familiar with the reporting functionality within Portfolio Manager. When you log into your account, it's one of the main tabs across the top of the screen. And the idea here behind the reporting functionality in Portfolio Manager is that metrics and results can only really drive action if you can clearly access and interpret the data that you've entered into Portfolio Manager. So this is the part of Portfolio Manager that allows you to get that information out in a format that you can use to make subsequent decisions. So from this tab, there are a number of different functions. On the upper right-hand side, you've got a number of performance documents that you can download directly from Portfolio Manager. If you click any of these links, you'll have the opportunity to select just that report, or you could select all of these reports at one time. At the top left, you've got this rotating carousel of quick charts and graphs, and I'll show you an example of one of those in just a moment. And then at the bottom of the screen, you have a series of Energy Star reports. And there are a number of custom or a number of preloaded or canned Energy Star reports that will already be in your account when you create a Portfolio Manager account. And then there's also the opportunity to create your own custom reporting templates. So just quickly, I talked about this rotating carousel on the upper left-hand corner. These are in the preset charts options. One of these is a total greenhouse gas emissions intensity report, and this is intended to give you an overview of your property emissions intensity across your portfolio. And this is just a screenshot of the information contained in this report. It includes portfolio averages, comparison to the national median, and then it also breaks out emissions intensity by any groups you've set up within your portfolio and by the different property types that you have benchmarked in your Portfolio Manager account. What's nice here is that any of these charts or graphs can be quickly printed or downloaded in a variety of formats, PDF, JPEG, PNG, for easy integration into external reports and presentations. And then if you scroll down below these graphs to the bottom of the page, you can actually view and export any of the raw data that was used to create each of these charts. All right, so let's talk now about some of the canned reports in Portfolio Manager. At the bottom of the page, as I mentioned before, you'll see a set of canned or standard reports. One of these is the emissions performance report. So you don't have to set this up. You don't have to define this template. If you create a Portfolio Manager account for the first time, once you log in, it's going to be there. To use the report, we actually go into, we've got a lot of resources that touch on how to use the reporting functionality in our basic Portfolio Manager introductory trainings, and we also have some how-to guides on the web. But basically, to use a report, you've got this action drop-down menu, and you say that you want to generate a new report. You select the buildings in your account that you want to include. You select the time frame or time frames that you want to include, and then you generate the report. Once a report has been generated, you'll be able to view it right there on your screen, and you'll also be able to export it in various formats such as Excel or XML if you are looking to do subsequent manipulation and analysis of the data. And as I said, this report is fixed. So anytime you run this report, it's going to query for the same set of metrics, and those metrics are presented here on screen. Direct, indirect, total greenhouse gas emissions, avoided emissions from both on-site and off-site green power. And as I mentioned before, Portfolio Manager treats this as a separate category of emissions. So that's why it's broken out on its own line. This report will also show the electric distribution utility associated with your property, as well as the associated eGrid subregion and the output emissions rate that is applied to your building's electricity consumption based on your eGrid subregion. One final item to cover, and this would be familiar to any of you who have been able to attend or view a recording of our setting targets and goals in Portfolio Manager presentation. But in short, there is building level functionality in Portfolio Manager that allows you to define both baselines and goals for energy, water, and waste performance at your building. So when you set a goal, a target for energy performance, Portfolio Manager will generate a series of prospective metrics that say, okay, if you were to hit this goal, here is the total amount of energy you'd be consuming, your site intensity, your source energy use intensity. It will also calculate the associated greenhouse gas emissions that your building would be expected to produce if you hit a specified target performance level. Now, one limitation here is that the target setting feature in Portfolio Manager takes into account your current fuel mix. So in calculating, how your building would be performing if it hit its target, the assumption is that your building would be using the same fuel mix as it is now, which is not necessarily the case. So if you wanted to dig into this a little bit further and you actually wanted to change the anticipated future fuel mix of your building and see how that would affect your score and your associated metrics, it would probably be more appropriate to use the target finder functionality in that Energy Star offers. One thing I will also note, and this is a great point to bring this up, is that EPA is soon going to be releasing a new calculator tool. It's going to be called the Building Emissions Calculator, and this is going to be a standalone tool that lives outside of Portfolio Manager, and it is going to calculate greenhouse gas emissions for specified properties in ways that go beyond what Portfolio Manager can currently do. So as I noted earlier, Portfolio Manager is most closely aligned with the location-based approach to greenhouse gas emissions calculations. In the new tool, the Building Emissions Calculator, it will perform the location-based calculation, but it will also allow you to apply any custom factors that apply to your building, such as market-based emissions factors that are provided to you by a supplier, or any local factors that have been determined by your local jurisdiction. One thing that's going to be nice about this tool is even though it lives outside of Portfolio Manager, there are multiple pathways for ingesting data from Portfolio Manager. So if you've already benchmarked your properties in Portfolio Manager, you won't need to re-enter anything. This tool will be able to reach into Portfolio Manager and pull out your building data to run these additional calculations. Finally, and this gets back to this question of understanding how changes in the future might impact your greenhouse gas emissions, this tool will allow you to assess emissions for a forecast year. And it will allow you to do that after making certain assumptions with regard to how your building will be performing in that future time period. Specifically, what your fuel mix will be, and if you're using more electricity in the future than you are currently today, or a greater percentage electricity than you are today. It'll allow you to account for any anticipated efficiency improvements. It will allow you to account for any anticipated use of off-site or on-site green power. And finally, it will allow you to see the impact of what a lower grid emissions factor would mean. As over time, it is anticipated that, local CO2 emissions factors associated with electricity production and consumption will come down. So this tool will allow you to do some better scenario analysis based on all of those factors. So we see it as a really exciting and important complement to Portfolio Manager and to the greenhouse gas calculation functionality that exists in Portfolio Manager today. All right, so just a quick recap before we head to some Q&A. So just covering what we went over today, we talked about how Portfolio Manager calculates your greenhouse gas emissions based on the data that you are entering when you benchmark your properties. We've discussed how Portfolio Manager accounts for any emissions benefits that come from green power use, and the way in which that can differ based on whether it's on-site green power or off-site green power. And then finally, we've talked a little bit more about the reporting functionalities that are baked into Portfolio Manager and how those can be used to extract any greenhouse gas emissions metrics that are generated by the tool. Now, we talked about some additional resources that are available. I just wanted to provide quick links to a few key resources right here. The first would be, the first two are technical reference documents. So we've got one that is dedicated specifically to how greenhouse gas emissions are calculated in Portfolio Manager, including the various emissions factors that are associated with different fuel types, and it goes into a lot greater detail about the justification for these methodologies. There are a lot of references cited and further discussion if you're interested in reading that. There's also a complementary technical reference that touches on how Portfolio Manager treats green power, specifically the difference between on-site and off-site green power, and how that will and won't affect various metrics that are calculated by Portfolio Manager. So if you do have questions that get sort of deeper below the surface of what we covered today, I would definitely recommend that you take a look at those technical references. And then finally, EPA also hosts the Center for Corporate Climate Leadership, and that link is shared here. Huge number of resources available there. One that I want to call out is the emissions factor hub. So they have documentation for national emissions factors for various fuel types and fuel uses. I wanted to note this because Portfolio Manager does try to stay in line with these emissions factors that are published here. So that's a great resource. And then, of course, this is a typical slide that you've seen if you've been on prior Energy Star webinars. We have a lot of additional help resources. If you have any questions, the first place to go would be energystar.gov/buildingshelp. So there, the first thing you'll see is an extensive list of keyword searchable FAQs, including, I believe, a subcategory of FAQs just focused around emissions. You can also from that page see an online access an online forum to submit any technical questions or comments you might have. So generally, if you have a question, our recommendation is first go and see if it's already been addressed in an FAQ, because we've got tons of them. You can search them by keyword. So in many cases, somebody's already had that same question and it's been documented. So that'll be a quick way to get the information you're looking for. If you have any other questions, especially those that may be more specifically aligned with your building, why you are or are not getting the results you expected, those would be questions for which you should submit a help desk ticket, and you'll get a direct response to that from the Energy Star help team. There are also a ton of additional training resources available on the Energy Star Buildings training site. So you can see the link there, energystar.gov/building/training. These include help resources in a variety of form factors. We have step-by-step how-to guides. We do offer access to the actual PowerPoint slide decks for many of our most common trainings. And we also have videos that we've created, YouTube videos that we've created to walk through some specific facets of Portfolio Manager. These are intended to be sort of complementary resources to our how-to guides, understanding that some people learn better looking at just looking at a piece of paper and following the steps, and other people absorb data better when they see it presented to them visually, like in a video. So we're trying to meet all those potential learning styles. With that, I want to go ahead and head into the Q&A session. If you can just give me 1 minute, I'm going to take a moment to familiarize myself with the questions that have been sent in during this session, and then I will get through as many of them as possible between now and 2 p.m. So just give me 1 moment.